Santa Monica Language Academy is dedicated to providing top-quality language classes for kids and adults. With over 15 languages to choose from, we offer intensive and full immersion programs in a small group class setting. Santa Monica Language Academy, the place to begin your language journey.
Hi and welcome to In the Chair. I'm Brenton Garron, your Executive Editor of Westside Today. In the lead up to the November 4 election, we have this special episode discussing the future of Santa Monica Airport. On the November 4 ballot, there will be two competing measures, and representing the campaign of Measure D, to my left is Christian Fry, and to the right, representing the campaign of Measure LC, is John Fairweather. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. The format of the show will be 1-minute answers, and for those watching at home, there will be a bell to mark the 1-minute time. Before the show, we flipped a coin to see who'll go first, and that was Christian Fry. So the first question is, can you share who you are and why you're representing the measure?
Thank you. My name is Christian Fry. I'm a 17-year resident of Santa Monica. I'm a small business owner, and I learned to fly here at the Santa Monica Airport about 12 years ago. I became involved in this issue because of my belief in the value of the Santa Monica Airport, our 97-year-old municipal airport. And as with any scheme to close an airport, what this is really about is the land. The 227 acres of the Santa Monica Municipal Airport is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate, arguably in the world. Powerful forces are behind the plans to close the airport and have its airspace protections removed and begin redevelopment. Like many Santa Monicans, I've seen enough development in our city. Measure D is simple and honest. It leaves all future decisions about whether we close and redevelop our airport and its 227 low-density acres with tens of thousands of Santa Monica voters and not 7 politicians. Would anyone want citizens to not have a vote? The voters should decide. On November 4th, please vote yes on Measure D.
Thanks, Christian. And John?
My name is John Fairweather, and I'm a 30-year Santa Monica resident. And I'm here to support Measure LC, which guarantees the voters will continue to have control over the future of the land and prevents the deceptive land grab that is going on by the National Aviation Lobby, which has so far spent $750,000 to seize control of this land from the city and have it for their own for the future, for a private jet port for the rich and famous. So, like virtually every other organization and community leader in this city, I'm outraged by the arrogance and deceit of these people, and I'm here to make sure that the electorate is informed and that we are not conned by this come November. So please vote yes on LC and no on D.
Thanks, John. For viewers at home, could you put what your measure means in the most simplest forms?
Sure. Measure D, when passed in November, is very simple. It puts the voters in charge of the most important land use decision in the history of the city. It gives voters, and not the politicians, the power to decide whether we begin the redevelopment process at the airport, and if we do, exactly what form that redevelopment would take. And there's been a lot of kind of confusing things that have gone on about the language of Measure D, but it's incredibly straightforward. It provides for a general municipal election, a simple majority of voters to make this decision, whether we close the airport and redevelop its land. So it's a very straightforward ballot initiative. It puts all the control in the hands of the voters. And again, we really think this is an incredible opportunity for the voters of Santa Monica to have total control over the future of what happens here.
Thanks, Christian. Sure. And John, can you explain Measure LC in its simplest terms?
Measure LC alters the Constitution so that the people retain control over the Santa Monica Airport land, rather than allow it to be seized by aviation lobbyists. And that control means that the city can continue to mitigate the health and safety impacts, which are doing so much harm to the surrounding community, that the people can be guaranteed in the Constitution of the city that there will be no development without our approval, and that in all likelihood the land that is released from aviation, if any is, because neither measure addresses that, will be used for parks, playing fields and recreational space, and not as a jet port for the rich and famous. Jet traffic is increasing at 30% a year over here, and soon this will be completely out of control and the entire city will suffer.
Thanks, John. I would now like to ask each of you the negative consequences if the competing measure passes. Christian?
Wow, well, Mr. Fairweather just made a lot of very false statements related to Measure D. If LC passes, read the language for yourself. This is all about the language. LC says very clearly that the airport can be closed with full authority of the City Council, 7 politicians making that decision without voter approval. It's clear as bell. There is no voter choice about whether or not that happens. It's left to the hands of the politicians. So if you're concerned about what is going to happen with what would potentially be the largest redevelopment project in the history of our city if this measure were to pass, all of that control is given to the City Council. There's no vote. The vote is with D. D very clearly defines voter approval is required before any change in land use at the airport, and we define it as a general municipal election with a simple majority. LC gives you no vote at all. It talks about approving limits. That's not a vote. A vote is who begins the redevelopment process, the voters or the politicians.
Thanks, Christian. And John, the negative consequences if Measure D passes?
Well, like most of Mr. Fry's NLP tricks, he has turned the facts completely on their head. The truth is that Measure LC gives you the power over development. Measure D seizes that ability. They've redefined the representative process of democracy to mean that you can't vote to change anything about this airport. Once every 2 years, you have to have a general election to do the most trivial thing. And that is been the situation since 1984, and they're making a lot of money. $8 to $10 million a year is being sucked out of the city coffers to subsidize jet and other aviation businesses. And this needs to stop, and it's supposed to stop on July 1st, 2015, and these guys don't want it to stop, and that's what this is all about, money.
Just 1 minute rebuttal each.
A bunch of other factual inaccuracies. The reality is, it's very simple. Measure D gives voters the power to decide who closes the airport and, if so, what development is done here. To say that Mr. Fairweather brings up this idea of supermajority that would require the total voting populace to go out and vote, that's been disproven by 3 state judges and the city attorney. It's a simple majority. It's defined in our language. To state that is just, he's lying to voters. It's not true. You can read the language for yourself. That's the most important thing. There's so much great information online. Educate yourself. What he is saying is not true. There are not 30% increase in jets. This is not the way that they're painting it. They do not want voters to have a choice, and they're lying to voters about the differences between LC and D.
John, 1 minute rebuttal.
Once again, what he says is a lie. This is what it's all about. The truth is that it's all about money. This is the funding from Measure D, 68% from out of state, 16% from elsewhere in California outside Los Angeles, 14% from aviation businesses here, and just 2%, $13,000 out of $750,000 so far, and there'll be well over $1 million by the time we're done. They are trying to prove the premise that you can buy Santa Monica and all it costs is $1 million and 6 months of lies, and you can have a piece of land and do anything you want about it, and that is outrageous. We should all be offended by the sheer arrogance of this, and we should tell them to go packing, and that's what we need to do in November.
This graph about who's paying for Measure D, this talks to motive, and I think it's worth talking about. The pilots are behind saving Santa Monica Airport because they like airports. They believe in the value of our 97-year-old municipal airport. What do they get if they win? The continued operation of our airport. Mr. Fairweather's one of his largest contributors, is one of the biggest developers in this city. So the real question here again is who decides whether we close and redevelop the land, because this is about the land, as every airport closure is. Santa Monica voters are not going to be fooled. Aviation pilots and aviation community is behind this measure because they care about our airport. The developers are behind LC because they want this land. They want the protections of our airspace to go away so they can develop 43 square miles of Westside with high-rise buildings. This is not the deceptive thing that Mr. Fairweather says. We have been very transparent about who is funding our effort, and it's not the evil thing that he's making it out to be.
And your response before we move on to our next question?
Once again, lies and distortion. This is the funding breakdown for Measure LC. You'll see that all of our funding comes from Santa Monica. This is all Santa Monica and the surrounding zip codes. Less than 2% comes from outside of the immediate area, and that's from a couple of local residents that recently moved out of state. Our average donation is $200. Their average donation is $10,000. This is the many versus the money. This is the 1% versus the rest. They want to keep their jet port open, and they don't care about any of the rest of us. And we need to stop that, because we can't allow that to happen in Santa Monica.
Thanks, John. In 10 years' time, can you please share your vision for the Santa Monica Air property on behalf of the measure you're representing?
Sure. I'm excited about the next 10 years for the Santa Monica Airport. Once we can put this issue behind us, ultimately who decides whether we close and redevelop the airport land, and we believe that voters see the value of our airport. In 10 years, I think we're going to end up with what will ultimately become one of the greenest, safest, and quietest airports in the nation. We've already made huge advances towards all three of those goals in the past. I'd love to see more improvements done to the airport property itself, actually putting money into the roads and public access to the airport. And ultimately, when we can finally start taking the tens of millions of dollars of federal money that are available to improve safety, noise, and pollution at the airport, residents will see a huge benefit. 10 years from now, we're going to see a much more integrated airport, a real part of our community, contributing even more than the $270 million it already does annually. This airport's going to really shine within the next decade, so I'm excited.
Thanks, Christian. And John, in 10 years' time, what would you like to be taking place here at the airport property?
Well, Measure LC allows a whole load of possibilities, and as Mr. Fry says, Measure D only allows one. Personally, I'd like to see a great park on this land, which is the likely likelihood if Measure LC passes. And such a great park, just like New York's Highline Park, which is now their number 3 tourist destination, would bring vast amounts of revenue to the city. It would solve the playing field shortage that has plagued this city for decades. It would more than double Santa Monica's developed parkland, and it would finally give land that was paid for by our grandparents back in 1926 with a parks bond back to us for its original purpose, so that the entire community, and rather than just 300 entitled people, get to use this land.
Thanks, John. If both measures receive more than 50% of the vote on November 4, the one with the most votes will take precedence. Do you think lobby fundraising will be the deciding factor in which measure wins?
I do not think that fundraising will be the deciding factor. I think this is all about the language. Measure D makes very clear that the decision to close and redevelop the airport land is left with the Santa Monica voters. Measure LC is equally clear. They bury the language very deceptively. The city has done everything it can to distance itself from the actual language that will go into the charter and changing the way that it's presented to voters by eliminating the 3 magic words, without voter approval. So they can close the airport. They've put 6 categories of development that they can do without any voter approval: the parks, the open spaces, recreational facilities, and the replacement of all the arts, cultural, and educational buildings on the airport property without voter approval. I think the voters should have a say, and I really think voters are going to decide which language they believe gives them the ultimate control over the property, and it's clearly Measure D. With voter approval, you make that decision. Measure LC says without voter approval. It will come down to people understanding the language.
Thanks, Christian. And John, lobby fundraising, will it play a role in who wins?
This is the spending in the entire Santa Monica elections, though so far this year. This is what Measure D has spent: $750,000, 63% of all spending, outspending all candidates and all other measures combined by a large amount. Now, they're not here because they're our friends, they're not here because they want to give us the right to vote, and they're not here because they care about development. They're here because there's money in it for them, and they want to seize this land and take it away from us. And it's very simple: follow the money. And Mr. Fry can say it's very simple over and over again, but when people say that often, you have to wonder. Just follow the money. That's really all you have to do. And look at the endorsements. We have hundreds of endorsements. They have 0, not 1 endorsement in all this time.
Thanks, John. To conclude this session, I have asked each candidate to ask the other spokesman a question. So, Christian, would you please ask your question to John?
Sure. So, Mr. Fairweather, they have their little flyer here that says, Measure D stipulates that a quote-unquote absolute majority of registered voters would have to agree to a ballot change. This has been disproven by 3 state judges and the city attorney as patently false. They continue to deceive voters with this ridiculous assertion that Measure D would require something other than a simple majority. 100 people vote, 51's a simple majority. I would like to know why Mr. Fairweather continues to push something that is absolutely untrue and has been proven in court to be untrue.
Well, it hasn't been proven in court to be untrue. It still has to be litigated in court. That was not the subject of what was being debated in court. It was thrown out along with the bathwater. The fact of the matter is that if you read the language that Measure D puts in the charter, it says a majority of the voters of the city, subject, verb, voting in an election, object, to pass a measure closing the airport. So the applicable part is a majority of the voters of the city, and that is 31,800 voters, and that has never happened in the entire history of Santa Monica. We have never reached that proportion. The vote that they offer you is a false vote. You will never be able to exercise it. They are seizing control absolutely from both the council and the people, and it's a con job, and you shouldn't fall for it.
Thanks, John. And your question for Christian?
My question for Christian is, given the fact that you have so far, despite $750,000 of spending, received zero, I repeat zero, organizational endorsements, and that Measure LC has received literally hundreds. Every single organization that looked into this has endorsed LC and opposed D, including the League of Santa Monica, League of Women Voters, SMER, Residocracy, Santa Monica Malibu PTA Council, Sierra Club, the Democratic Club, Santa Monica for a Livable City. The list goes on. Why should anyone believe that you or anything you say or any of your mailers have to say is true?
The fact is, John, that our mailers are absolutely 100% factually accurate. Your mailers are the ones that are lying to voters about this supermajority, about giving themselves control over the airport land. There's only one ballot measure. Measure D was brought forward with 15,000 plus signatures of Santa Monicans. We have a mandate from the people. They want a vote. Measure LC gathered 0 signatures. It's the politicians' countermeasure to D. They want that control to remain with the politicians. This is not a complicated thing. They want to paint a picture of pilots and the aviation community as this evil person. It's not the case. Our airport has been supporting this community for 97 years. What do they get if the airport stays? The airport. What do the developers get if LC passes? The sky's the limit. I have no idea. And it is completely deceptive to say that voters do not deserve to have a vote. There is no vote in LC. It clearly says without voter approval that the city council can redevelop the land. Simple as that.
Thanks, Christian. And then finally, your last question for John.
Sure. And it goes right to this point. So the 3 magic words in Measure LC state that the airport has full authority without voter approval to close and redevelop the airport land. Why are the proponents of Measure LC against residents having a vote about the future of this property?
The City Council currently has the authority to do what it likes with the airport. July 1st, 2015, they are looking into those possibilities. Measure D was brought by deceiving people for $20 a signature to sign a petition to stop that. So I don't believe for a moment that the community shouldn't have a voice. They should absolutely have a voice, and that's what LC gives them. It gives them a vote on what happens to any land that is released, which is the critical question, not whether or not we take these guys' jetports away from them, which may or may not happen because that's not addressed by LC. It's just that we have to have the power to make those decisions, and they don't want you or the council to have that power, which is why they've redefined voter approval.
Thanks, John. And then to conclude the segment, can you please ask your final question to Christian?
Yeah, given the fact that Measure D will allow the airport to continue to endanger the health and the well-being of the community surrounding the airport, and that it will continue to drain $6 to $8 million of potential income out of the city coffers and into aviation business and that money could be used for such things as after-school programs for schools, sports, music, and that it's a con job to take away the land from the community that bought it back in 1929. I have one very simple question to coin your phrase. How do you guys, you and your associates, sleep at night?
First of all, the two or three statements that you made are factually inaccurate. The airport is currently operating in the black and will continue to do so. The airport meets every state and federal environmental regulation to which it's standard. Of course, we can continue to improve that with the federal money that the city has refused. But, you know, again, I sleep perfectly well at night. I want voters to have the choice about whether or not we close the 227 low-density acres of the airport or not. We don't want to leave this to 7 politicians. We've seen runaway development in Santa Monica for 30 years. This would ultimately be the biggest land use decision in the history of our city. Voters should decide. Measure D gives you that right. Measure LC says clearly, without voter approval, the airport can be closed and redeveloped. And they can also start the redevelopment tomorrow on all the non-aviation land. I sleep perfectly well at night, Mr. Fairweather. I'm not lying to voters. You are.
And finally, can you share the website for your measure where people can find more information?
Absolutely, yeah. There are 2 websites you should look at. The first one is on the ballot measure. It's smvotersdecide.com. And the other great website is the Santa Monica Airport Association site. It's santamonicaAirport.info.
And John, the site for Measure LC?
The site for Measure LC is www.itsourland.org. And you can find the answers to all your questions and many postings about all these details to back up with references and facts everything that I've said and disprove everything that he said.
John, Christian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back next week, so don't forget to check out westsidetoday.com to see who's in the chair. I'm Brenton Garron for Westside TV. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.